A summer morning in Chicago, 1915. The river barely moves. A steamer sits at a downtown wharf, already crowded with thousands of people dressed for a company picnic. It never leaves the dock. There is no iceberg, no open sea. The ship leans further and further until it rolls onto its side, still tied to the wharf. Hundreds of people drown here, 20 feet from dry land, in 20 feet of water. People remember the Titanic, the iceberg, the band playing into the night. This was nothing like that. It happened in daylight at 28 minutes past 7 in the morning. 844 people died at this dock, more passengers than the Titanic, and almost no one remembers their names. Chicago, July 24th, 1915. The river runs straight through the center of the city, past the warehouses and the bridges, dark and slow. On the south bank between Clark Street and LaSalle, a steamer is tied to the wharf. Her name is the Eastland. She is 265 feet long, built for speed on the lakes. But the men who sailed her already had another name for her. They called her Crank, a ship that did not like to sit still. This morning she is loading more than 2,500 people, workers from a single factory, with their wives, their children, their best summer clothes. They are going to a picnic. None of them expect that the most dangerous part of the day is the ship that has not yet left the dock. For 7 years, the Western Electric plant in Cicero had sent its workers across the lake for 1 day each summer, a whole company on its 1 day off together. They built telephones. Most were young, many were immigrants, Czech, Polish, Hungarian families who had already crossed one ocean to get here, and now lived a few streets from the plant in Cicero and Berwyn. 7,000 tickets had been sold. 5 ships were chartered to carry them across to Michigan City. The Eastland was the first to load. By 6:30, the gangways were packed. Families found places along the rail and waved at the wharf, where a band really was playing. On the dock, not on the doomed ship of the legend. An inspector stood at the gangway with a hand counter and stopped the line when it reached 2,500. The Eastland was full. Below the waterline, no one was watching her balance closely enough. To understand what happened next, you have to look below the waterline at a problem the Eastland had carried since the day she was launched. She was long and narrow, with a shallow draft for the rivers and a tall superstructure for the passengers. The weight that should have steadied her sat too high. Her balance depended on water, pumped into ballast tanks deep in the hull. Trim those tanks correctly and she floated level. Get it wrong, with a full deck of people, and she would lean until the river found her open lower gangways. She had listed before. More than once with passengers aboard, she had leaned hard at the dock. Every time, the crew had caught her in time. Every time but one. 3 years earlier, the Titanic had gone down with too few lifeboats. 1,500 people died in the cold, and the world swore it would never happen again. In 1915, a new federal law required ships to carry boats and rafts for far more of the people aboard. It was written to save lives. On a ship like the Eastland, it added thousands of pounds of wood and iron, bolted high on the decks, exactly where she could least afford the weight. Engineers later estimated that by that morning, her margin of stability had shrunk to inches. The reform written to prevent the next Titanic helped capsize a ship that never left the dock. No single decision sank her. A chain of them did. At 6:41, with the decks still filling, the Eastland began to lean toward the dock. The crew opened her ballast tanks to bring her back. For a while it worked. Then the list moved the other way, out toward the river, and it would not come back. Below, the engineer worked the tanks. Above, no one yet understood. Water began to come in at the low gangway. Dishes slid from the galley shelves. People laughed at first, leaning with the deck as if it were part of the ride. Then, at 28 minutes past 7, the Eastland rolled onto her side. It took less than 2 minutes. Hundreds were thrown into the river. Hundreds more were trapped inside the hull, in the dark, under the water, while a crowd on the dock stood close enough to touch the steel. People in the water clustered so thickly they covered the surface of the river. Onlookers threw down boards, ladders, wooden crates, anything that might float, to people they could not reach. A company nurse named Helen Repa heard the sirens and forced her way to the river. She was the first medical help to arrive. She commandeered 500 blankets from a department store, turned a hospital boiler room into a warming station, and worked for 8 hours straight. Men cut into the hull from above with acetylene torches. The captain tried to stop them, shouting that they would ruin the ship. A welder shouted back that his orders were to save lives, not to be careful of the boat. A tugboat eased its stern against the overturned bow and held there, a steel bridge to the shore, and people walked across it out of the river. Divers went down into the flooded cabins again and again. By mid-morning, the rescue had become a recovery. The living were gone from the river. What was left was inside the hull, and under it, they brought the bodies out in rows. A nearby armory was turned into a morgue, the dead laid in lines of 85 across the floor, close to 800 of them waiting to be claimed. Families walked the rows through the night, looking for the faces they had sent off that morning. The coroner's physician examined nearly everyone. Most, he found, had not drowned. They had been crushed or had suffocated in the dark. By the 29th of July, one body was still unclaimed, a 7-year-old boy, tagged only with a number, 396. The newspapers called him the Little Feller. His name was Willie Novotny, and his whole family had gone down with him. 22 entire families were erased that morning, parents and children together, with no one left to bury them. The Sindelars lost 7, the Novotnys 4. Of the dead, 7 in 10 were under 25. 228 were teenagers. 58 were small children. The Bohemian neighborhoods of Cicero lost more than 200 of their own in a single morning. Whole blocks went into mourning at once. The cemeteries west of the city filled with the same date, carved again and again, July 24th, 1915. The city wanted someone to blame. A grand jury indicted 6 men, the steamship company's officers, the federal inspectors who had certified her, the captain, and the chief engineer. To defend them came one of the most famous lawyers in America, Clarence Darrow. His client was the chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, the man who had worked the ballast tanks as she went over. In the winter of 1916, a federal judge in Michigan held a hearing to decide whether the 6 should even stand trial in Chicago. He found barely a scintilla of proof. The owners had not been aboard. The crew's conduct, he ruled, looked more like innocence than guilt. He refused to send them. And that was the end of it. No one was ever convicted of anything for the deaths of 844 people. The civil case dragged on for almost 20 years. When it finally ended, a court ruled the disaster was beyond the owner's knowledge, and the engineer, by then long dead, was named the cause. Erickson had died in 1919, at 34, of a failing heart. He could not answer the verdict that blamed him. The historian who studied it longest called him what the record suggests he was, a convenient fall guy. The families got nothing. The only money the law allowed came from the wreck itself, $46,000 of scrap, and the creditors took all of it first, most of it owed for raising the hull. Their relatives had died inside. The people who lost everything were paid the value of the ship that killed them, 0. The hull itself did not die. They righted her in August, pumped her out, and sold her for scrap to a buyer who saw something still worth saving. The Navy bought her, rebuilt her, and renamed her the Wilmette. The ship that had drowned 800 people became a gunnery trainer on the same Great Lakes, and once, in peacetime, sank a captured German submarine for practice. She served quietly for 30 years. In 1943, she even carried a president on a fishing trip. Then, in 1947, she was cut up for scrap and the Eastland was gone for good. More passengers died on the Eastland than on the Titanic or the Lusitania, but the Titanic had millionaires and a band and the open Atlantic. The Eastland had factory workers, a downtown river, and an ordinary Saturday. There was no one rich or famous aboard, no grand voyage to remember, and so the country that wept for the Titanic let this one slip quietly out of its memory. A poet who lived in the city wrote bitterly that he saw a dozen Eastlands every morning on his way to work, and a dozen more going home at night. He meant the people no one counts until they are gone. For decades there was not even a marker. It took a group of students asking why to put up the first one in 1989 on the south bank a few steps from where she rolled. The last survivor died in 2014 at 102. She had been 3 years old at the dock. With her went the final living memory of the morning the river took 844 people who had only come to celebrate. 844 people went to a picnic and never left the dock. This is their morning.